Don't worry about it, Jen. Most of us don't get to pick our nicknames. She-Hulk, Episode 2, Superhuman Law. I'm getting nervous now. Now, here's the first thing. I mentioned after reviewing the premiere that, I wasn't entirely sure what to make of the show so far. I was enjoying Jennifer as her characterization, and I did get some enjoyment out of that episode, but that episode didn't really give me much of a feel for what the show was going to be like, because it was pretty much all backstory stuff. It was stuff that had to be done, had to be gotten out of the way, and didn't feel like it was indicative of what the show was going to be going forward. This feels a little bit more like it's setting the groundwork for here's what it's going to be like. And it's not sitting quite right. Now, admittedly, right off the bat, part of this might actually, the fact that I like She-Hulk and specifically like the She-Hulk run that this is pulling very directly from might actually be a detriment to my enjoyment. I will explain. So there are some little tweaks that have happened that have to, by necessity of the fact that She-Hulk is just being introduced into the MCU, and there were things about her in the Dan Slott run in the comics where they were allowed to happen a certain way because she was an established character and she existed in a world with a lot more established weirdness than the MCU currently has. So, for example, they 180-degree flipped the situation with her getting the new job offer. Here's what I mean by that. In this, her being a superhero basically lands her the new job, and she is expected to appear in court as She-Hulk. And she is expected to work as She-Hulk. That's what they want. They wanted She-Hulk to be the face of a superhero law branch. In the comics, it's the opposite. They don't really want She-Hulk. She comes with the package, and the fact that she is a superhero gives her a certain amount of experience, but they want Jen Walters. The reason that happens that way in the comics is because she's at a point where, frankly, she's a heck of a lot more confident as She-Hulk. So the whole thing in the comics is she has to present as her less confident self in order to get this job and appear in court. Whereas in this, it's going the other way around. Well, sort of. Admittedly, she lacks confidence as She-Hulk currently in a way that in the comics she did as a human, but it still completely flips the reason she's hired for this job. It alters the character of Holloway and actually, frankly, makes him more of a dick than he was in the comics. Not that, he's a treasured character or something. How dare you! You make Holloway not the way he was. I don't care that much, but it's just completely altered the dynamic of her at this job. Whereas she took it before thinking she could just kind of, be all flashy and kind of She-Hulk her way through it, but she had to kind of relearn just being a good lawyer, which she is, but she hadn't had to really knuckle down and do it just as a normal person for a long time. And then there's all the stuff related to just the fact that the Marvel universe in the comics has a lot more background and story, so you could have casual appearances of, secondary villains. You could have something like the awesome android is basically the office intern. You had the fact that the archivist at the law firm was effectively just a comic book geek, which was one of my favorite things about that. I thought that was brilliant, and he was a great character. But it's all stuff that can't be introduced. And I don't think it occurred to me when I knew they were going to do the show how much these additional elements added to what I liked about the original comic book version of this story. Now, I'm not going to say the story's not worth telling without those, but that's kind of why I say I think this is where my love of the original comic run that this is based off of is harming my enjoyment, because I know everything that's missing. And it's not missing because they didn't think it was important or they're disrespecting the source material. It's missing because the MCU wouldn't support it. The MCU wouldn't support a lot of the random cameo drop-ins that the comic had. The MCU wouldn't support just the way that Jen even came at the job, because here she's still coming to terms with being She-Hulk. So it's altered the entire perspective and dynamic in a way that it isn't sitting quite right, but I don't feel comfortable saying is actively bad, but it's different in a way that it hadn't occurred to me that it would feel. It feels also a little bit more like, so the previous episode had a fair amount of jokes, and it kind of felt like it was telling a story about how Jen Walters became She-Hulk and took moments to tell jokes, and most of those jokes were in the form of banter between her and Bruce, which enabled it to feel like a character thing and just part of their dynamic. Here, the jokes feel a bit more, for lack of a better way to put it. They don't feel as organic to the situation. They feel more setup and punchline. And some of the jokes are even kind of decent. I like the idea that Titania, she's just briefly described as a superpowered influencer, and she was fleeing traffic court. Like, I'm kind of hoping we get more of her, because I rather like the idea of this just incredibly superficial and vain superpowered person, and how that just causes issues. Just for someone like that to have those kinds of powers. It also has the potential to get into like really bad influencer satire, so that could go either way. Or like, I genuinely laughed at the gag where Bruce says, "Oh, I was a different person back then," literally, because he was literally played by a different actor. It's kind of a lame joke, but I did laugh at that. I'll be curious to see, getting more of Emil, of the Abomination. But again, even that just feels like, it feels like it's the best that the MCU in its current form is going to do. Again, to make the comparison to the comic, which at this point I have to firmly believe that me knowing the comics is making this harder for me to enjoy. But in the comics, her first major case is a guy who gets superpowers who doesn't want them, and he's suing his job because he basically had an on-job accident that gave him superpowers. But nobody wanted to take the case because they're like, you now have superpowers. How are you going to sue for damages when you're now superhuman? How is that damages? But she takes on that case, and it's a really interesting case, and it's really interesting to see a guy who just, he wants a normal life, and he can't have it now. That is damages. And it's well done, and it's interesting, and it's a perspective not often given in comics, because usually the whole arc of a normal guy who gets powers is, and they learn to be a hero. Like, this guy's never going to be a hero. He hates that idea. And it's just more interesting than the Abomination is up for parole. But again, for what is currently at play in the MCU, that's kind of what they have to work with to try and do this stuff. I was glad that they brought up the cage fighting, because I did find myself wondering, like, is that going to be a problem? Is that a known thing that he does that? And clearly it wasn't. So, and, Tatiana Maslany's still working for me. I think she is enjoyable as Jen. You know what? In some odd ways, the show also missed opportunities for jokes. I think they really are counting on that one line in the first episode about spandex is your best friend to cover a lot of stuff, because, like, we had just established that she needs to get like a whole new wardrobe, and yet when she's on site and changes into She-Hulk at the office, none of her clothes rip. She takes her shoes off, good detail, but none of the clothes rip. But more sort of, the one that really left my head scratching was, okay, so you have her show up at this maximum security facility to meet with Blonsky, and she shows up as She-Hulk, gets told she can't be using superpowers in the facility. She has to go back to Jen, and the suit more or less fits. Like, why is it not hanging off her? Why are the sleeves not out here, or at least visibly like folded up, and it's a very badly fitting suit? That's just such an obvious visual gag, and like, to the point that I'm not even saying it would be a good gag, but like, it's right there. Why would you not do it? It undercuts her authority as an attorney, and it made sense to do so in the scene that we were getting. I don't know. Uh, I I'm not giving up, and I'll definitely stick with it. And again, this is not even me saying people shouldn't watch it, but my expectations and now realizing how many of the elements in the original comics can't be replicated in the MCU with the MCU as it currently is taking away from some of my enjoyment that I might have otherwise had, which bums me out. We'll see if I can like make a mental shift come next episode or down the line and like get more into accepting what this is instead of what I wish it was. Although part of what makes it harder is this is one of the things that is pulling more directly from like pulling more direct one-to-one elements from a storyline that I know than Marvel often does. Other than origin stories, they actually kind of freeform their own narratives, and you're not usually making direct comparisons. Even when they use the exact title of something, like Civil War is a completely different thing from the comic book event Civil War, even though they share a title. But this, like, I'm spotting, like, this, I know all this stuff, but this is done slightly different and parts are missing, and how much of a resemblance it currently bears to the comic book run I love means I'm noticing those differences and absences more than maybe I would otherwise. Maybe now that they've got her established, and this first case is a case that wasn't in the comics, at least not in the ones that I read. So, maybe that shift will help me get more in the headspace for this. I hope so. Like, I love She-Hulk. I want to like this. But right now I'm just kind of like, okay. Which wouldn't be as much of a problem, except I want to love it. We'll see. We'll see what next episode's like. So, Superhuman Law. What'd you think of this episode? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon's what pays the bills, allows me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out there, like, share, subscribe, all help as well. Don't worry too much about that either. Take a relaxed attitude around here so you can come on back next time you need a break. Time to give my thanks to my highest supporting patrons. That would include Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Emu Delkey, Theotha Boyd, Becky Sparks, Fernabi Likes the Poodle, Zach, Idolin, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Adam RDL Taylor, Shane Ross, Shayla Gourlay, Brendan LaRose, and TT. If you want your name said while these guys try and distract me, consider looking at the rewards of my Patreon.